The Institute
for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
Hello and welcome to Short Circuit, your weekly podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeal. I'm your host, John Ross, joined this week by Evan Bernick and Clark Neely of the Institute for Justice's Center for Judicial Engagement. What is judicial engagement? Head over to Evan Bernick's regular column at the Huffington Post to get an idea. Just Google Evan Bernick and Huffington Post. This week on the podcast, a fishy boat seizure, a campaign finance collision, and healthcare red tape. Evan, kick us off.
So this case involves the destruction of a sailboat off the coast of Florida. It's a boat in which James Hoffling has lived for several years. In 2010, he was aboard his sailboat when officers pulled alongside. The sailboat was then in working order. It was intact. He had documentation. It was his boat. The officers informed him that the boat was derelict. This turned out actually not to be accurate. It was in working condition and it wasn't abandoned or anything like that. And they put the notice of a code violation on his boat. They didn't indicate precisely what code he was violating, but they told him to fix his lights, and they left the notice there. Couple months later, he is out of town. He comes back and he learns that his boat has actually been destroyed. And he brings, pursuant to what the city calls a cleanup plan for boats that are deemed derelict and therefore can be destroyed. And he brings a constitutional claim arguing that this violated his due process of law rights and that it violated the Fourth Amendment.
Just a quick point of fact before we move on to Clark. He did, in fact, fix the code violations that the officers pointed out. He upgraded his lights.
Yeah, there was also supposedly a missing marine toilet. Look, this is not some really nice sailboat that's sitting in a marina with a bunch of other nice sailboats and they just picked on him. This guy is, from the description in the case, it sounds like he's kind of almost a vagrant that happens to live on a sailboat. But what really matters in this case is that this is his home, even if it's perhaps somewhat junky looking. And there are certain procedures that the government has to go through before it can take somebody's home, or frankly any property, and destroy it. And if it's permissible for the city of Miami, that's who's involved here, that's the defendant, to take a boat because it's derelict and destroy it, then there's a procedure that they need to go through in order to determine that. And you don't just cut to the conclusion and allow law enforcement officers to designate property as derelict on their own discretion without sufficient notice to the owner. That is exactly what happened in this case. And really the incredible disrespect for property rights that was displayed by the officers involved. They did not give this guy significant notice, or certainly didn't notify him that he was in danger of having his boat destroyed. As Evan mentioned, when they put the supposed code violation sticker on the boat, they didn't even check a box to identify what code was supposedly violated. So this was a slap and dash procedure that resulted in the destruction of a man's home that happened to be his boat. And the question is whether the judiciary can or should do anything about it.
Right. And there are really two core questions here. One, was the boat, in fact, derelict at all? And two, even given that it was derelict, was proper notice given to this guy of what he needed to do in order to restore its conditions and ensure that it wasn't destroyed? And there's also the issue of, even given that it was derelict, was immediate destruction the only thing that they could have done? Was that the only alternative, or could they have done something more to respect his property rights? Because it is his property. He is the lawful owner. And
So there's an interesting procedural twist in the case for our civil procedure fans, and that is when the plaintiff in this case originally filed suit, he attached to his complaint some of the reports that the police filed regarding the boat. It's clear from his complaint that he believes the contents of those reports to be largely false, to contain false assertions about what procedures were followed and what the condition of the boat was. His original complaint was dismissed. He filed a second complaint in which he chose not to attach those reports. And in dismissing the second complaint, the district court complained that the plaintiff was, in effect, trying to pull the wool over the court's eyes by deliberately failing to attach those reports the way he had done with his first complaint. And for those who are up on their civil procedure, you'll know that the court was not permitted to take into account anything that was not attached to the complaint. And so the district court felt that he was essentially trying to hide the fact that the police officers had made these comments and these reports that were omitted from the second complaint. But that's really interesting because it is the prerogative of a plaintiff in any proceeding, and certainly in a civil rights proceeding, to assert and allege the facts in the way that they choose. And he was under no obligation to attach anything to the complaint or to make the city's case for it, which is essentially what the district court seems to feel he should have done. The 11th Circuit correctly and emphatically rebuked the district court for its own departure, the district court's own departure from the very well-established rules of civil procedure, and made clear that the plaintiff in a civil rights case is free to allege the facts the way they see them. Now, that they're not free to make up facts, they're not free to misrepresent things, they certainly don't need to include facts beneficial to the other side, as the district court seemed to think this guy did. So it was a correct ruling on the civil procedure part of the case.
So the 11th Circuit revives the case. What happens now, Evan?
It goes back down to the district courts, and on remand, they will consider whether the officers who did this were entitled to qualified immunity. That is, that even if they did violate his constitutional rights, they were doing that pursuant to a reasonable construction of what they believed the Constitution could be, and therefore they are civilly immune and essentially don't have to pay him.
Yeah, and one other claim, too, whether the city should be liable for the conduct of its employees. Of course, all private employers are liable for the conduct of their employees, but the Supreme Court has very graciously held that government employers need not be liable for the conduct of their employees, and you actually have to allege and then establish a policy or practice, which he has alleged in the complaint. He's alleged that there's a policy of destroying quote-unquote ugly boats, and if he can prove that, then the city would be liable.
And speaking of unaccountable government agents, Clark.
Well, the next case is IJ's Virginia Certificate of Need case involving medical devices, specifically imaging devices. Boiled down to its essence, Virginia has a law, as do a number of other states, that if a doctor or hospital wants to acquire a significant new piece of equipment, let's say an MRI, it actually has to go and get permission from the state before it is allowed to go out and purchase that piece of equipment. This goes back several decades to a time when the thinking was, well, we need to encourage efficient investment in medical resources like imaging machines. And of course, the best entity to encourage efficient investment is the government. And the government will decide when it makes sense for a hospital to buy an MRI and when it doesn't. And the idea essentially is that, let's say you got one hospital that buys an MRI and then the hospital across town wants to go out and get one, and the first hospital's MRI isn't paid off yet. Now those two machines will be kind of in competition for each other with patients. That was the original supposition of these laws. Of course, like so many other regulations, they're just economically baseless. There's no reason to believe that the state government has any ability to allocate resources efficiently in this industry. But that's the premise of the law, and IJ challenged it in large measure on the grounds that the way the law works, which is that it gives local, meaning Virginia-based hospitals and medical providers the ability to intervene in an application to acquire a new piece of medical technology, and that has the overall effect of discriminating against providers who are out of state. That's the issue that went up to the Fourth Circuit, and Evan will take it from there.
Yeah, so it's important to clarify that these are not licensing laws. There's no claim on the part of the state that these people are incompetent to provide the services that they're seeking to provide. Con laws effectively, or con schemes rather, serve as permission slips to compete in a particular area. In this case, the claim was that the need for medical services that these plaintiffs sought to provide was already met, and therefore you didn't need to have any further competition. And what the court did, they took a very differential approach to the articulated interest the state put forward. They said, we can't see a sinister motive or a protectionist purpose in an effort to bring medical care to all the citizens of the Commonwealth, and they relied mostly upon what the state articulated in the record and in the context of legislative proceedings to justify the laws, instead of trying to see whether they actually produced or were calculated to produce the effects that the state claimed that they were.
Yeah, there's a quote at one point in the opinion where they say that certificate of need regimes like this one are designed, in the most general sense, to prevent overinvestment and maldistribution of healthcare facilities. It reminded me of a Supreme Court case from the 1930s called New State Ice, where the state of Oklahoma made it illegal to go into the ice production business for the exact same reason, in order to prevent, the inefficient investment in the ice industry. It was absolutely ludicrous to suppose that Oklahoma was in fact trying to prevent inefficient investment in the ice industry. They were obviously trying to protect existing ice manufacturers, and B, ludicrous to suppose that the state has any ability to do that, even if it was sincerely trying to do so. I don't believe there's any reason to suppose that anything has changed in the last 80 years or so. And in fact, if anything, we're now even more acutely aware of the fact that almost certainly when you see a scheme like this, it is about discouraging competition and has nothing to do with quote unquote prohibiting or preventing maldistribution of resources or overinvestment.
The facts of this case make plain that it's not only ludicrous, it's also pretty clearly, not an exaggeration to say deadly. Our plaintiff is trying to perform colonoscopies with a new innovative procedure that uses a scanner. Colon cancer is an extremely deadly form of cancer, and a lot of folks don't get the screenings that they need to because colonoscopies are very invasive.
Right. So just to expand on that really quickly, our client in this case proposes to buy an MRI machine to provide what are called virtual colonoscopies to people in Virginia, meaning it doesn't have to be a physical invasive procedure. Instead, it's an imaging procedure. And of course, that's a really desirable thing to have happen. That will not happen as a result of the court's decision. That will not happen because Virginia medical providers have objected to our client obtaining the MRI machine, by the way, to use for a purpose that no one else in Virginia is using MRI machines right now. And you're exactly right. The outcome of this case will be to discourage medical innovation and to make sure that patients don't have access to a procedure that would be very desirable. Again, on the premise, and in my judgment, the false premise that the state is genuinely trying to look out for the people of Virginia by preventing, again, quote unquote, maldistribution of resources in the medical field and inefficient investment of resources. We've known for over a century that the states rarely are trying to do either of those things and cannot do them even when they are trying.
So that's sort of the public choice background. Legally, what's going on, Evan?
So this case involves a so-called dormant commerce clause. The Commerce Clause, the U.S. Constitution, gives Congress the ability to regulate commerce in order to prevent states from setting up trade barriers. Therefore, the Supreme Court has held states cannot do things that would obstruct that ability by setting up trade barriers themselves. And the question and the calculus that goes on in these cases is whether the state has acted either facially, that it means on the express terms of the statute, or with the purpose and effect of discriminating against interstate commerce. If the answer to that question is yes, then you get strict scrutiny, and the states need to make a very demanding, compelling showing that what they're doing is necessary to protect a compelling interest. If the answer to that is no, then you go into a different kind of analysis. This is the so-called Pike analysis that focuses on whether what the states have done is clearly excessive in comparison to any local benefits that have been provided by what it's done.
With respect to the Fourth Circuit, I think they got both of those inquiries wrong in this case. First of all, if you look at who benefits and who is burdened by this law, the beneficiaries are clearly in-state, so it's local hospitals, local doctors are able to prevent other firms from acquiring potentially competing equipment.
By formally intervening in the application process.
That's right. So the Virginia resident companies and practitioners have the ability to intervene in someone else's application to acquire equipment and prevent it from happening. So that's a clear benefit to them. In other words, by essentially they're able to eliminate potential competition. And if you look at the who is mostly burdened by the law, it's people from outside the state of Virginia. So practitioners who want to set up shop here, and particularly the manufacturers of equipment that would otherwise have been sold in Virginia is not getting sold. So I think that there's clearly discrimination in effect. And if you turn to the Pike test that Evan mentioned, it's absolutely clear that there are significant burdens on interstate commerce here. There is a tremendous amount of commerce that is not crossing the Virginia state line as a direct result of this law. And so you have to look at the putative benefits, and in this case, they are zero benefits for local Virginia residents for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. So again, the Fourth Circuit disclaimed any formalistic analysis and acknowledged that needs to be done in a way that's realistic and case by case. Unfortunately, that's really not the way the analysis unfolded in the actual case, at least the way I read it.
Yeah, the discussion of putative benefits is actually particularly glaring. The court just basically says, look, these people who work for the state of Virginia who support this plan say that it works. And that was essentially the end of the analysis.
And if you want to do anything about it, you have to go to the legislature.
Right.
Yeah, and that's actually happened, and there's a decent chance the law will be repealed in the Virginia legislature. It may be notable that the genesis of this law, this actually was at one time more or less a federal requirement. The feds essentially exerted pressure on the states to enact these kinds of laws. And then the feds, after a few decades, turned on a dime when it was clear that these laws don't do anything to advance the stated ends of, ensuring efficient investment in the medical industry. The feds actually turned around and said, actually, you know what, our bad. Feel free to take the laws off the books. Most states have done so, and hopefully Virginia will follow suit.
Okay, let's move on to the next case, which comes out of the D.C. Circuit. Evan.
So this case involves a challenge brought to by a congressman to a rule by the Federal Election Commission interpreting a campaign finance law. The rule in question requires corporations and unions to disclose only donations made for the purposes of furthering electioneering communications. And the congressman is arguing that the rule is too narrow. The statutes should cover all donations irrespective of donative purpose. And the question is whether the FEC rule is actually consistent enough with the statutes such that it can be upheld.
Yeah, and the short answer is yes, because the general trend of the case law here is essentially that there are virtually no limits on administrative agencies to essentially make policy. If there's any remotely applicable statutory text, then the courts are going to be extremely deferential. And so most of the opinion is a fairly unremarkable exploration of the relevant administrative law principles. Was there a sufficiently clear statement of purpose? Are the purposes that the FEC has identified in adopting the rule at least consistent with the statute, if not mandated by it, and so forth? And the answer to all of those questions is an unexceptionable yes. What's really more interesting about the case is Judge Brown's point that she makes throughout, but especially at the end, that there's a number of levels of what's going on in this case. There's the administrative law question of whether the FEC could permissibly promulgate the particular regulation that it did. The answer to that is an easy yes. But the more interesting question is the lurking constitutional issues in the background, and specifically the tension between people's interest in free and sometimes anonymous political speech and the government's increasing pressure on people who participate in the political process, including by donating money, to be identified, to identify themselves, and to disclose.
Right. I mean, tension is a mild way of putting it. Another way of putting it would be a contradiction. On the one hand, the Supreme Court has emphatically affirmed that people have a right to speak anonymously. On the other hand, it has consistently upheld, public disclosure laws that require people to turn their information over to the government when they spend money for particular purposes, including political purposes. So effectively, the Supreme Court has two conflicting lines of precedence, and this administrative agency, in this case, the FEC, is trying to navigate that, and that's where the discussion comes in.
Yeah, and look, I mean, these questions are as fundamental as anything in our nation's history. Look back to the founding era, and a great deal of the political literature that was published around the colonial times was anonymous. And so it kind of comes down to a question of, if we allow a pamphleteer to not put his name on the pamphlet, as oftentimes many of the founders did not, and for very good reason, by the way, because much of what they were publishing would have been considered treasonous. Do we require someone who funds the publication of that pamphlet to identify themselves and expose themselves to the same repercussions that the author doesn't want and justifiably doesn't want to experience? Those issues are absolutely every bit as much relevant and live today as they were back then, just in a different context.
Right. The first question you need to ask in any context in which the government is exercising coercive power is, why is it doing that? Is there a good enough reason for it to be forcing somebody to do something that they would not otherwise do?
In this case, disclosing their identity when they support a particular cause.
Is there a compelling interest? Does the government have a compelling interest in ensuring people are informed about how other people are spending their money in order to further their political goals and in order to speak?
So the plaintiff, the congressman, would argue yes.
Yeah, right. That's the position of the plaintiff in this case. And, it's I would say an interestingly contested issue. We actually did some empirical work on this, and essentially the results of the study suggest that in the abstract, people are interested in knowing who's spending money to support what causes. But in the concrete, when the question is, well, do you want to be? Do you have to have your name disclosed when you are involved in political activities? The answer is usually no. So it's one of these classic things where it's, what's sauce for someone else's goose is definitely not sauce for my gander. I want to be able to engage in politics and support causes anonymously, but I don't think other people should be able to do that. That seems to be the state of the empirical data. And then the question is, essentially, as Evan correctly pointed out, whether the government has a sufficiently compelling or important interest in forcing people to identify themselves when they participate in politics, including by supporting it with money. That's a very live question and one the Supreme Court has not squarely addressed.
Right, and in this case, Judge Brown is largely giving the context for the FEC's rules. She's not suggesting that the Supreme Court should resolve it one way or the other, but she's identifying a contradiction, and the Supreme Court does eventually need to come to terms with the fact that they have two inconsistent lines of precedent.
Okay, that concludes the show. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is John Ross from the Institute for Justice calling upon you to get engaged.